Today we have a story about a night in 1874 when 300 men believed they had cornered a helpless old carpenter in rural Alabama. They carried torches and war hoods and rode in formation like an army, mobilizing for an easy victory. But the man waiting inside that small wooden cabin was not what they assumed. He was not defenseless, and by morning those same 300 men would be begging to understand how their careful plan had turned to ash in their hands. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. The cicadas sang their nightly hymn as Elias Mercer drove the final nail into the porch board. The hammer's echo faded into the humid Alabama darkness. He straightened slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back. The kind of pain that reminded a man he was 55 years old and not getting any younger. The replaced board fit perfectly with the others, a testament to decades of carpentry work that had kept his hands busy and his mind occupied since the war ended 9 years prior. Elias wiped sweat from his brow with a worn handkerchief. The August heat clung to everything, even this late in the evening. His small homestead sat at the edge of the Reconstruction town, isolated enough that most nights he heard nothing but insects and the occasional owl. He preferred it that way. Solitude was simpler than the weight of conversation, simpler than the looks white folks gave him when he walked through town with his toolbox. He gathered his tools methodically, placing each one in its designated spot in his leather satchel. The hammer, the measuring tape, the box of nails, everything had its place, just like Miriam used to insist. 3 years she had been gone, and still he organized his life according to her preferences. It brought him comfort. These small rituals made the empty cabin feel less hollow. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped toward the front door. His boots were caked with sawdust and red Alabama clay. Miriam would have scolded him for tracking dirt inside, would have made him leave them on the porch mat she had woven from corn husks. He still left them there every night, honoring habits she had instilled in him during their 23 years together. Inside the cabin, Elias lit a single oil lamp. The warm glow illuminated the sparse interior. A table, 2 chairs he could not bring himself to remove, hers a wood stove, and the narrow bed where he slept alone. Miriam's quilt still covered it, the blue and white pattern she had stitched during long winter evenings. Photographs were luxuries he could not afford, so memory was all he had. Sometimes it felt like enough, most times it did not. He moved to the window to close the shutters, a nightly routine he performed without thinking. The forest beyond his small cleared yard stood dark and dense. Pine trees rose like sentinels, their silhouettes black against the slightly lighter sky. That was when he noticed the lights, faint at first, distant pinpricks weaving between the tree trunks. Elias paused, his hand on the shutter latch. Fireflies perhaps, but fireflies did not move in straight lines, did not advance with such deliberate purpose. His pulse quickened, a sensation he recognized from another life, another version of himself. He forced his breathing to remain steady, forced himself to watch and assess rather than react. The lights multiplied, dozens, then scores, then hundreds of small flames carried on poles, moving through the darkness in coordinated formation. As they emerged from the tree line, Elias saw the riders. White robes gleamed in the lantern light, hoods covered faces, 300 men, maybe more, spreading out in a wide circle that slowly, methodically, tightened around his homestead. The chanting began low, almost like a rumble of distant thunder. Then it grew louder, individual voices merging into a unified roar of accusation and threat. Thief, devil, hiding, what ain't his? Elias stepped back from the window. His soldier's mind took over, cataloging details with cold precision. 300 riders meant they had organized this carefully. The coordination spoke of planning, of leadership. This was not spontaneous rage. This was orchestrated. He moved through the cabin quickly, extinguishing the lamp first. Darkness was an advantage. He knew every inch of this cabin, every board, every corner. They did not. His hands did not shake. That surprised him. 3 years of peaceful carpentry. 3 years of trying to be the man Miriam wanted him to be, and still his body remembered this feeling. The cold calculation, the absence of panic, the transformation from civilian to something else entirely. Through a gap in the shutters, he watched a rider move to the front of the mob. The man sat taller than the others, his posture radiating authority. Even through the distance and darkness, Elias recognized Judge Silas Broderick. the man who had been pressuring him to sell his land for months, making increasingly aggressive offers that Elias had politely declined. The judge raised a piece of paper high above his head. "By legal warrant," he shouted, his voice cutting through the mob's noise, "we demand entry to search these premises for the missing child." Elias knew what that paper was worth. Nothing. Judge Broderick specialized in creative paperwork, in documents that looked official but crumbled under actual legal scrutiny. He had heard stories from other black landowners, tales of forged deeds and manufactured debts. Something was very wrong here, and as the mob pressed closer, their lanterns casting writhing shadows across his walls, Elias understood that this night would test everything he had tried to leave behind in the war. The mob's chanting grew more specific. A boy's name, Thomas Whitfield. Accusations that Elias was hiding him, that he had spirited away some white teenager for unspeakable purposes. Lies. All of it. Elias had barely spoken to any white children in this town. He kept to himself, did his work, went home. "I ain't hiding no child," Elias called out through the door, keeping his voice level and clear. "And I ain't seen your warrant validated by any federal authority." The mob jeered. Someone threw a bottle that shattered against his porch rail. Judge Broderick's laugh carried across the yard. "You dare question the law, boy?" Elias's jaw tightened at the word boya, man of 55 reduced to childhood. By white authority, but he kept his voice steady. "I question a piece of paper waved in the dark without proper service or witness." Then a single rider broke from the mob's formation. A voice rang out, commanding and familiar. "Hold, I will speak with him first." The crowd parted reluctantly. Sheriff Asa Dalton rode forward on a gray mare, his badge catching lantern light. Elias recognized him immediately. The same man who had come begging for medical help after the war, suffering from infection and fever. Elias had treated him with the field medicine knowledge he had learned as a Union scout, probably saved his life. Asa dismounted and walked toward the cabin door. "Elias Mercer," he called out, "let me inside. We need to talk, just you and me." The mob grumbled, but fell silent. Elias considered his options. Asa had never been cruel to him, had even nodded respectfully when they passed on the street. But that was when it cost him nothing. Tonight, with 300 armed men watching, respect meant very little. Still, refusal would only hasten whatever violence they had planned. Elias opened the door just wide enough for Asa to slip through, then barred it again immediately. In the darkness of the cabin, the two men stood facing each other. Asa removed his hat. "This ain't right, Elias. I tried to tell them. But Judge Broderick, he's convinced the boy's here. Says someone saw you with him yesterday near the creek." "That's a lie." "I know it is." Asa's voice dropped lower. "But that don't matter to them. You know how these things go. They're looking for an excuse. Any excuse. And Broderick's given them one wrapped up in legal language." "Why?" Elias asked. "Why now? Your land. You know why? Broderick wants it. Wants all the parcels along the creek for some development scheme. You're the only one who won't sell, so he's manufacturing reasons to take it from you." Elias felt a cold fury settle in his chest, but he kept it controlled. "And you gonna help him do it?" Asa looked away, and in that moment of hesitation, Elias saw everything he needed to know. The sheriff was a coward, not cruel by nature, but weak when cruelty wore authority's costume. "I can't stop them," Asa said finally. "There's too many, but if you just let them search, if you cooperate, maybe they'll see there's no boy here and leave peacefully." "You believe that?" Asa was quiet. "They'll burn my home whether they find anything or not," Elias said. "You know it. I know it. This ain't about a missing boy. This is about scaring me off my own property." Before Asa could respond, Judge Broderick's voice boomed from outside. "Time's up. Sheriff, you coming out, or do we come in?" Asa moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm sorry, Elias. I truly am. Sorry. Don't keep a man's home standing." The sheriff left. Through the gap in the shutters, Elias watched him return to his horse, watched him exchange words with the judge, watched him shake his head in what might have been protest or resignation. Either way, the result was the same. Asa mounted his horse and rode to the edge of the mob's circle, placing himself where he could watch but not intervene. Judge Broderick raised his hand. "By the authority granted to me as circuit judge of this county, I hereby declare this man in contempt of legal process. We will proceed with the search." The mob surged forward, but not all at once. They moved in calculated stages, testing his defenses, A group of men approached the front door with a heavy log, preparing to ram it. Others circled toward the back. Still others positioned themselves near the windows. Elias had built this cabin with Miriam, had chosen every beam and board with care. He knew which sections could withstand force and which could not. He knew the weak points and had reinforced them years ago, not because he expected this moment, but because good carpentry demanded attention to structure. The first crash against his door sent vibrations through the entire cabin. The oak bar held. The second crash cracked the door frame slightly, but the bar remained secure. The third crash made the men outside curse and step back, nursing bruised shoulders. "Burn him out," someone shouted. And there it was. The thing Elias had known was coming from the moment he saw those lanterns approaching through the trees. Judge Broderick wanted his land, and if Elias would not leave it alive, he would leave it dead. The mob would turn his home to ash, and in the morning, Broderick would claim he had tried to prevent the tragedy, would shake his head sadly at the stubbornness of a difficult Negro who had brought destruction upon himself. Through the shutters, Elias watched men gather kindling and torches, watched them stack wood against his porch supports, watched them prepare to transform his home into a funeral pyre. Something dark and familiar stirred inside him, something Miriam had made him promise to keep buried. But Miriam was gone, and 300 men meant to erase him before sunrise. The first torch touched the kindling stacked against the porch. Flames spread quickly, licking up the dry wood with hungry enthusiasm. Orange light flickered through the cracks in Elias's shutters, casting writhing shadows across the cabin's interior. Smoke began to seep through gaps in the floorboards. Elias moved to the center of the cabin, his mind calculating distances, timelines, and possibilities. The crowd outside had grown louder, their chants transforming into a unified roar of anticipation. They expected him to run. He expected him to burst through the door, choking and desperate, ready to be captured or killed. They did not know that. Elias Mercer had spent 4 years as a Union scout behind Confederate lines, had learned to move through hostile territory without detection, to turn defensive positions into traps, to think 3 steps ahead of men who considered themselves soldiers. Most importantly, they did not know that this cabin had been built by a man who understood structure not just as carpentry but as strategy. He dropped to his knees and pressed specific floorboards in a precise sequence. 3rd board from the east wall, 5th board from the hearth, 2nd board near the back window. Each one lifted easily, revealing the crawl space beneath. Not a simple root cellar, but a carefully constructed network of passages that extended beyond the cabin's footprint. Emerging at 3 separate points in the surrounding forest, Miriam had known about the tunnels, had insisted he build them during Reconstruction's early, dangerous years, when night riders made violence against freedmen commonplace. "I won't live in fear," she had said, "but I won't live foolishly either." She had been wise in ways that still humbled him. Elias descended into the largest tunnel opening, pulling several loose boards back into place above him. The space was cramped but navigable, reinforced with timber supports he had installed with the same precision he brought to all his work. He moved quickly through the darkness, his hands reading the tunnel walls like a familiar text. Behind him, the cabin groaned as flames consumed the porch supports. He could hear the mob's excited shouts, hear Judge Broderick ordering men to watch the windows in case their quarry tried to escape. Let them watch. Let them believe he was still trapped inside. The tunnel branched in 3 directions. Elias took the southern passage, the one that emerged near the old oak tree where he and Miriam had buried her wedding ring after arthritis made wearing it painful. A full 100 yards from his burning home, hidden by thick undergrowth, he emerged into the night air, carefully moving the camouflaged entrance covering back into place. The mob's attention remained fixed on the cabin, on the growing fire, on their certainty of victory. Elias circled through the forest, moving with the silence he had perfected during the war, positioning himself where he could observe without being observed. From his new vantage point, he could see the entire scene. 300 men arranged in a loose circle, their lanterns creating a ring of light around his burning home. Judge Broderick sat on his horse at the circle's north point, watching the flames with undisguised satisfaction. Sheriff Dalton remained at the circle's edge, his posture rigid with discomfort, but his position unchanged. Then Elias noticed something that made his blood run cold. Approximately 40 yards from the mob's southern edge, half hidden in the tree line, stood a small figure, a boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, his pale face illuminated by the distant firelight. Thomas Whitfield, the missing child whose disappearance had supposedly justified this entire action. The boy was not missing, he was watching, and from the way he kept glancing nervously at a man positioned nearby, a man whose build and bearing suggested authority, Elias understood with sudden, terrible clarity. This was not about a missing child at all. This was theater. The boy had been hidden deliberately, to be found at whatever moment served Judge Broderick's purposes best. Probably, they had planned to discover Thomas inside Elias's cabin after burning it, planting evidence that would posthumously justify the killing. When that became impossible, because Elias had not fled as expected, they would need a different revelation. Perhaps they would rescue Thomas from the forest at dawn, claiming Elias had stashed him there before the siege. The story would shift, but the conclusion would remain the same. Legal justification for taking Elias's land. Movement near the cabin drew his attention. The fire had grown intense enough that men were backing away, shielding their faces from the heat. Part of the roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks. The mob cheered. "Burn, devil!" Someone shouted. "Burn for your crimes." But some men were not cheering. Elias spotted approximately 20 riders positioned around the circle's perimeter who sat in uncomfortable silence, their body language suggesting unease rather than celebration. Not everyone in this mob was here by choice. Some had been pressured to attend, threatened with social or economic consequences if they refused to participate, coerced rather than convinced. One of those reluctant riders, a white man named Nathaniel Crawford, who ran the general store and had always been polite during their transactions, dismounted and walked toward the burning cabin. He stopped several yards away, staring at the flames with an expression that might have been doubt or regret. Judge Broderick noticed immediately. "Problem, Crawford." "Just thinking," Nathaniel said carefully, "that we haven't actually found the boy yet, or any evidence. Maybe we should make certain before." "Before what?" The judge's voice turned sharp. "Before we protect our community. Before we send a message that certain behaviors will not be tolerated." Nathaniel looked down, but he did not return to his horse. He stood there at the edge of the firelight, separate from the mob's unified violence. It was a small gesture of doubt, but in this moment, it felt significant. The cabin's far wall collapsed. More cheers erupted. Judge Broderick stood in his stirrups, addressing the crowd like a general rallying troops. "Let this be a lesson to any who think they can defy proper authority in this county." Elias watched from the forest shadows, calculating his next move. He could disappear into the night, use the tunnels to retrieve supplies from hidden caches he had maintained since the war, vanish before dawn. Part of him wanted exactly that, to walk away from this place, this violence, this endless battle against men who would always see him as less than human. But leaving meant accepting. Judge Broderick's theft meant abandoning the land where Miriam was buried, the home they had built together, the small plot of earth that represented everything they had fought to secure in freedom's uncertain years. And leaving meant the judge would simply move on to the next black landowner. Then the next, using the same manufactured accusations and orchestrated violence. No, Elias would not run, but neither would he fight the way they expected. There was a third option, one that required patience and precision, one that Miriam would have approved of, even as it required using skills from the part of his life she had begged him to leave behind. As the fire burned itself toward exhaustion, as the mob began to grow restless waiting for a victim who would never emerge, Elias melted back into the forest darkness. He had work to do, preparations to make, a trap to set. The mob believed they had one. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming that the old carpenter they had surrounded was simply a carpenter. Their third was forgetting that some men carry wars inside them long after peace is declared, and that cornering such a man might not end the way they expected. Dawn arrived, gray and cold. The cabins remained smoldered, sending thin columns of smoke into the morning sky. The mob had dispersed hours earlier, their triumphant celebration fading into exhausted confusion when no body was found in the ashes. Judge Broderick had ordered men to search the ruins anyway, poking through charred timber with long poles, insisting Elias must be buried somewhere beneath the collapse. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. From his position deep in the forest, Elias had watched the mob's confusion grow, watched riders split off in groups to search the surrounding woods, their earlier confidence replaced by only watched Judge Broderick's face darken with fury as his carefully orchestrated spectacle failed to produce the definitive ending he had planned. By mid-morning, most of the riders had gone home, leaving only the judge and a core group of perhaps 30 men to continue the search. Among them was Sheriff Dalton, now tasked with officially investigating Elias's disappearance. The absurdity would have been laughable if it were not so dangerous. Elias waited until they were distracted, then moved silently toward where he had seen Thomas Whitfield the night before. The boy and his handler were gone, but Elias could track their movements easily enough. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, boot prints and soft earth of forest told stories to those who knew how to read them. The trail led northeast, toward a hunting cabin that belonged to Judge Broderick's brother-in-law, Harold Jennings. Elias knew the place, had even done repair work on its roof 2 summers ago, back when Jennings had been cordial and the judge's interest in his land had not yet turned hostile. He approached carefully, using every technique he had learned during the war. The cabin appeared empty, but a faint column of smoke rose from its chimney. Someone was inside, trying to keep warm and probably keep quiet. Elias circled the structure, noting the fresh horse droppings near the back, the supplies stacked inside the lean. The general sense that people had been staying here recently, despite the hunting season being months away. This was where they had hidden Thomas Whitfield. This was the staging ground for their manufactured accusation. He considered his options. He could confront whoever was inside, could try to extract the truth through conversation or force, but that would alert Judge Broderick's network, would set in motion the very violence Miriam had begged him to avoid. There had to be another way. A way that exposed the truth without requiring him to become the violent man the mob already believed him to be. As Elias contemplated, he heard voices approaching through the woods. He ducked behind a fallen log, pressed himself into the undergrowth, and watched as Harold Jennings emerged into the clearing, accompanied by a younger man Elias recognized as Deputy Marcus Webb. "Boy's getting restless," Webb said. "Keeps asking when he can go home. Judge says we keep him here until this blows over." Jennings replied, "Another day or two, then we'll stage the rescue. Say we found him wandering in the woods, traumatized but alive. And if someone asks why we didn't find him sooner, we say the Negro must have moved him in the night before the fire, must have had help. Use it to justify investigating other black families in the area." Jennings spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Judge has it all worked out. This ain't his first time dealing with stubborn darkies who won't sell." Elias's hands tightened into fists. He forced himself to remain still, to listen rather than react. Miriam's voice echoed in his memory. "Violence begets violence. Breaking the cycle means choosing a different path, even when that path is harder." "What about the boy's parents?" Webb asked. "The Whitfields paid them off, told them Thomas would be home safe in a few days, and they'd get $500 for their trouble. They were happy enough to take it." Jennings laughed. "Turns out, most folks have a price." The 2 men entered the cabin. Through the small window, Elias could see them talking to someone inside, presumably young Thomas, though he could not make out the words. After several minutes, they emerged again and headed back toward town, leaving the boy alone. Elias waited until their footsteps faded completely. Then he made his decision. He would not hurt the boy, would not even speak to him, not yet. But he needed evidence. Something that could not be dismissed or explained away. Something that would expose Judge Broderick's scheme in a way that even the most complicit townspeople could not ignore. He spent the next hour moving systematically through the area, documenting what he found. The supply cache, fresh enough to prove recent use. The specific tracks showing multiple horses coming and going. Marks in the dirt, where someone had practiced riding in circles, likely Thomas keeping himself occupied. Most importantly, he found a ledger book tucked inside the leon, partially hidden beneath canvas tarps. The ledger contained records of land acquisitions, all in Judge Broderick's distinctive handwriting. Page after page of forged deeds, falsified transactions, and payments made to county officials who looked the other way. Elias's own property was listed, with notes in the margin. Subject refuses sale. Alternate methods required. This was it. This was the evidence that could undo everything. But possessing it was only the first step. He needed to deliver it to someone with actual authority, someone beyond Judge Broderick's influence, someone who would act on what they saw rather than bury it to protect their own complicity. The nearest federal authority was in Montgomery, more than 100 miles away. Elias had no horse, no money for train fare, and every white person in the county would be watching for him. Getting there would require the same skills that had kept him alive during the war: patience, planning, and the ability to move through hostile territory without detection. He carefully wrapped the ledger in oilcloth, secured it against his body beneath his shirt, and began moving south through the forest. He would travel mostly at night, avoid main roads, and rely on the underground network of black families who helped escapees during slavery and continued helping freedmen during Reconstruction's dangerous years. But first, he needed to visit one more place, needed to retrieve something from his property that would prove essential for the journey ahead, something he had buried after Miriam's death, believing he would never need it again. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Elias approached the smoldering ruins of his cabin from the east, using the thick pine stand as cover. The search parties had moved on, leaving only Sheriff Dalton sitting on his horse near what used to be the front porch. Staring at the ashes with an expression that might have been guilt or simply fatigue, Elias watched him for several minutes, weighing the risk of what he was about to do. Then he stepped from the tree line, crossing the open ground between forest and cabin without hurrying, without hiding, walking as though he had every right to be there, which he did. Asa Dalton saw him and went completely still. His hand moved toward his pistol, then stopped. For a long moment, neither man moved. Finally, Asa dismounted slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Thought you were dead," the sheriff said. "Thought you'd help them make sure of it." Asa looked at the ground. "I didn't. I tried to." "You tried to do nothing," Elias corrected, "which is what you did. Nothing." The words hung between them like smoke. Asa's jaw worked silently. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "They would have killed me too if I'd tried to stop them. Would have burned my home next. You don't understand what it's like." "I understand exactly what it's like," Elias interrupted. "I understand fear, understand pressure, understand what men do when they're scared. But I also understand that every man makes a choice about who he is when the test comes. You made yours." Asa looked up, and there were tears in his eyes now. "What do you want me to do, Elias? What am I supposed to do now?" Elias considered the question carefully, considered whether Asa Dalton could be trusted, whether redemption was possible for a man who had stood aside while violence unfolded. Then he thought about Miriam, about her endless capacity for believing people could change if given the chance. "I want you to stop lying to yourself that you did everything you could," Elias said, "and I want you to decide whether you're going to keep serving Judge Broderick's corruption or start serving actual law." He pulled the ledger from beneath his shirt and held it out. Asa stared at it like it might bite him. "That's Judge Broderick's records," Elias explained. "Proof of forged deeds, bribery, all of it, including his plan to frame me using Thomas Whitfield, who ain't missing at all. Boys hidden in Harold Jennings's hunting cabin, waiting to be rescued whenever the timing serves the judge's purposes. Where did you? Don't matter where I got it. Matters what you do with it." Elias's voice hardened. "You can take it to Montgomery, to federal authorities who might actually care about justice, or you can give it back to Broderick and help him bury it. Either way, you're choosing who you are." Asa took the ledger with shaking hands. He opened it, read several pages, and his face went pale. "Lord help us. If this gets out, half the county officials will be arrested. Good, maybe the other half will learn something. They'll kill you for this. If they know you have evidence, they already tried to kill me for nothing. I'd rather die for something." Elias turned to leave, then paused. "And Asa, if you do the right thing, if you actually take that to Montgomery, then maybe you'll sleep better at night. Maybe you'll be able to look at yourself in a mirror without feeling sick." He walked back toward the forest, exposing his back to the sheriff, trusting that Miriam's faith in human capacity for change might be justified, trusting that the shame in Asa Dalton's eyes was real enough to spark something like courage. Behind him, Asa called out, "Where will you go?" "Somewhere I can't be followed," Elias replied without turning. "Somewhere I can wait to see if you're the man I hope you are." As he disappeared into the tree line, Elias felt something shift inside his chest. The cold fury that had sustained him through the night was still there, but now it was joined by something else, something that might have been hope, fragile and uncertain, but real nonetheless. He had crossed the line now, had moved from passive victim to active resistance. Judge Broderick would not forgive this. The mob would be hunting him with renewed fury once they understood he had evidence of their crimes. But Elias had survived worse odds during the war. had learned that survival sometimes required calculated risks, and he was done surviving in silence, done accepting that men like Broderick could steal and destroy without consequences. If Asa Dalton failed him, if the sheriff handed that ledger back to the judge, then Elias would find another way, would fight until his last breath if necessary. But he had to try to believe that some men could still choose decency. When given the chance, Miriam would have expected nothing less of him. 3 days passed in the deep forest. Elias moved between safe houses maintained by black families who remembered him from the war, who understood the language of resistance that freedom had not erased. They fed him, sheltered him, and asked no questions beyond what he needed. On the 4th day, a message found him through the network. Asa Dalton had left for Montgomery, had taken the ledger, and requested federal intervention. Judge Broderick was furious, had sent riders after Asa, but the sheriff had anticipated this and taken back roads with an escort of freedmen, who knew the territory better than any posse could navigate. The message also warned that Broderick had tripled the bounty on Elias's head, and spread word that he was dangerous, armed, and possibly planning attacks on white families. The lie was predictable but effective. Fear spread through the county like brushfire. White residents who had been neutral now barricaded their homes at night. Some black families were harassed for supposedly harboring a fugitive. Elias knew he could not hide forever. The longer this dragged on, the more people would suffer. But neither could he simply surrender and hope for justice. Not with Broderick controlling the local courts and most law enforcement still loyal to him despite Asa's defection. He needed a different strategy, needed to apply the same tactical thinking that had kept him alive behind enemy lines during the war. And as he considered his options, he remembered something his commanding officer had once told him. The best defense is making your opponent afraid to attack. Broderick was afraid of evidence, afraid of federal scrutiny, afraid of losing his carefully constructed network of power and corruption. So Elias would give him more to fear, would show the judge that burning one cabin had not destroyed the threat, had only forced it to evolve. He began gathering his own evidence, documenting everything he could about the mob that had surrounded his home. He visited families, both black and white, who had been coerced into participating, asking careful questions, building a record of who had been threatened, who had been bribed, who had objected but been overruled. Most importantly, he sought out Nathaniel Crawford, the general store owner who had expressed doubt during the burning. He found Crawford alone in his stockroom late one evening, and the man nearly fainted when Elias appeared from the shadows. "Don't shoot," Crawford gasped, raising his hands. "I ain't armed. I know, just came to talk." They spoke for over an hour. Crawford confirmed that he had been pressured to join the mob under threat of having his store's credit cut off by the bank which Judge Broderick controlled through his brother-in. Crawford had witnessed the preparations, heard the judge discussing the fake warrant and the planted evidence. He was willing to testify, but terrified of retaliation. "I got a wife and 3 children," Crawford said miserably. "If I speak against Broderick, he'll ruin us, make it so we can't do business anywhere in the county." "He's ruining you anyway," Elias pointed out, "making you complicit in crimes. When federal investigators arrive, and they will arrive, you'll be swept up with the rest, unless you can prove you were forced into it." Crawford's hands shook as he considered this. Finally, he nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Write down everything you saw, everything you heard, dates, names, threats. Keep it hidden until the federals come. Then give it to them directly, not through any local authority." Crawford agreed, and he was not the only one. Over the next week, Elias collected written statements from 17 different people, each one documenting some aspect of Judge Broderick's operation. Individually, they were minor testimonies. Together, they formed a damning pattern of systemic corruption. Meanwhile, Asa Dalton reached Montgomery. The federal authorities were skeptical. At first, local disputes were messy, and reconstructions, political complexities made every accusation suspect. But the ledger was concrete evidence, and Asa's willingness to risk his position as sheriff suggested genuine concern rather than political maneuvering. A federal marshal named Josiah Briggs agreed to investigate. He sent word ahead that he would be arriving in the county within 2 weeks, accompanied by a full investigative team and military escort. Judge Broderick could not intimidate or bribe federal marshals, the way he controlled local officials. When news of the coming investigation reached the county, reactions divided sharply. Some residents welcomed it. seeing an opportunity to finally challenge Broderick's stranglehold on land and law. Others viewed it as unwanted federal interference in local affairs, a violation of the limited autonomy Southern counties had managed to retain during Reconstruction. Judge Broderick responded by escalating. He called a public meeting at the courthouse, drawing a crowd of several hundred people. Elias watched from a concealed position in the building's upper gallery, risking exposure to witness what the judge would say. Broderick painted himself as a victim of false accusations spread by a vengeful freedman who refused to accept proper authority. He claimed the federal investigation was politically motivated, an attempt to punish white Southerners for exercising their legal rights. He appealed to racial solidarity, to fear of black empowerment, to every ugly prejudice he could invoke, but his performance was not as effective as it would have been 2 weeks earlier. Too many people had seen the coordinated mob, had participated reluctantly, or witnessed from windows what really happened that night. Doubt had taken root, and when Broderick called for renewed action against criminal elements in the black community, the response was muted compared to the enthusiasm that had fueled the original attack. After the meeting, Elias intercepted Asa Dalton on the road back to town. The sheriff had returned from Montgomery looking exhausted, but determined. "Marshal Briggs is coming in 10 days, Asa reported, bringing federal troops for security. He's requested statements from anyone willing to provide them, and he's specifically interested in interviewing you. I'll be there." "Broderick knows," Asa warned. "He's preparing some kind of response. I don't know what, but he's been meeting with his core supporters privately, planning something. Let him plan. Long as the Federals arrive before he acts, his options are limited." Asa looked at Elias with something like awe. "How are you so calm? They tried to kill you, burned your home, put a price on your head, and you're just waiting." "Not waiting, preparing." Elias gestured to the forest around them. "During the war, I learned that panic gets men killed. Patience keeps them alive. I'm patient, and I'm prepared. What happens when the marshal arrives? Truth happens, evidence happens, justice happens if we're lucky." They parted ways as dusk settled. Elias returned to the safe house where he was staying, a small cabin owned by a widow named Eloise Parker, who had known Miriam and insisted on helping. Eloise fed him, tended to the cuts and bruises he had accumulated during his forest travels, and asked no questions about what came next. That night, Elias reviewed all the statements he had collected, organizing them into a comprehensive record of Judge Broderick's operation. He included his own written testimony, detailing every interaction with the judge, every pressure to sell his land, every warning sign that had preceded the mob attack. He also drafted a letter to the federal authorities, explaining his tactical background, his Union service, and why he had chosen to gather evidence rather than flee or fight. He wanted them to understand that his actions were deliberate, measured, and designed to expose systemic corruption without adding to the violence that already plagued Reconstruction's uncertain landscape. As he wrote, he thought about Miriam, about her insistence that dignity mattered more than revenge, that how you fought determined whether victory was worth the cost. He had fought her way, with truth instead of bullets, with patience instead of rage. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen, but for the first time since his cabin burned, Elias felt something like hope, real hope, grounded in concrete action and growing support. Judge Broderick had underestimated him, had assumed that destroying his home would destroy his will. That was the judge's mistake. Elias Mercer had survived for years of war, had built a life from nothing, had endured grief that might have broken a lesser man, and he was still standing, still fighting, still believing that justice was possible if enough people chose courage over fear. 10 days until the marshal arrived, 10 days to hold on, to keep gathering evidence, to prepare for the confrontation that would determine whether truth mattered. More than power in this county, Elias intended to be ready, and he intended to win not with violence, but with the one thing Judge Broderick could not burn, the truth itself, documented and witnessed and impossible to deny. Federal Marshal Josiah Briggs arrived on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by 20 soldiers from the Freedmen's Bureau and 2 civilian clerks to document testimonies. Their presence transformed the county overnight. Judge Broderick's supporters retreated into nervous silence. Black families emerged from fearful hiding, and the investigation began in earnest. Marshal Briggs set up operations in a requisitioned building near the courthouse, deliberately choosing a location that symbolized federal authority, superseding local power. He was a tall man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades enforcing law in places where law was contested. His eyes were hard but fair, and he listened without interrupting when Elias presented his evidence on the third day of the investigation. "This is comprehensive," Briggs said, after reviewing the statements and the ledger. "More thorough than most investigations we conduct. You military were scouted for General Sherman during the war." Briggs nodded, understanding immediately why Elias's documentation was so methodical. He realized Judge Broderick will claim all of this is fabricated, that you and your collaborators invented these statements to exact revenge for legitimate law enforcement action. "I do, but 17 separate testimonies, all corroborating specific details, will be hard to dismiss, especially when combined with the judge's own handwriting in that ledger." "Agreed. We'll also be interviewing Thomas Whitfield." The boy's parents finally admitted he was never missing, that they were paid to keep quiet. They're terrified now, trying to cooperate in exchange for leniency. This was the breakthrough Elias had been hoping for. With the Whitfield's cooperation, the entire foundation of the mob attack crumbled. The missing child's story was exposed as fiction, and every action justified by that fiction became criminal conspiracy. Over the next week, Marshal Briggs and his team interviewed dozens of witnesses. Some confirmed Elias's account eagerly, relieved to finally speak truth without fear of retaliation. Others were reluctant, torn between honesty and loyalty to neighbors who had participated in the mob. A few refused to cooperate at all, sticking to the story that Elias was dangerous and the mob had acted in legitimate self-defense. But the evidence was overwhelming. The ledger alone documented years of systematic fraud, combined with testimonies about the coordinated mob attack, the manufactured accusations, and Judge Broderick's explicit threats to anyone who refused to participate. The case became undeniable. Judge Broderick responded by filing formal complaints against the investigation itself, claiming federal overreach and demanding that local authorities handle any disputes. He organized rallies, circulated petitions, and appealed to racial solidarity among white residents. His rhetoric grew increasingly desperate, invoking northern aggression and loss of southern autonomy. Some residents were swayed by these appeals, but many more recognized them as the manipulations of a cornered man trying to escape consequences. Nathaniel Crawford publicly came forward with his testimony, defying threats to his business. Other reluctant mob participants followed his example, each confession weakening Broderick's position further. The turning point came when Marshal Briggs arrested Harold Jennings for kidnapping and conspiracy. Jennings had been housing Thomas Whitfield during the supposed disappearance, and his own records documented payments received from Judge Broderick for this service. Faced with federal charges and potential imprisonment, Jennings broke quickly, providing detailed testimony about the judge's schemes. "He's been doing this for years," Jennings told the marshal, his voice shaking. "Not just to Elias Mercer. Dozens of black families forced off their land through manufactured charges, forged documents, coordinated violence. I helped because I was afraid of what would happen if I refused, but I ain't proud of it." This testimony opened new investigative avenues. Briggs sent his team to examine land records throughout the county, finding pattern after pattern of suspicious transactions involving Judge Broderick and his associates. Black families who had owned their land for years suddenly appeared on paperwork as having sold it for nominal sums, or as having defaulted on debts they never owed. Within 10 days, the investigation had documented at least 37 separate instances of fraud, intimidation, or violence orchestrated by Judge Broderick's network. The scope of corruption was staggering, even by Reconstruction standards. Where such behavior was depressingly common, Marshal Briggs called for a formal hearing to determine whether criminal charges should be filed. The hearing would be public, conducted under federal authority, and Judge Broderick would be required to answer questions under oath. The judge tried to refuse, claiming judicial immunity and asserting that federal courts had no jurisdiction over state-appointed officials. Briggs overruled him. "Your position gives you responsibilities, not protection from prosecution. You'll answer questions like everyone else, or you'll be held in contempt of federal authority. Your choice." The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday in the courthouse, the same building where Broderick had held power for nearly a decade. The symbolism was deliberate. Federal law would now be enforced in the space where local corruption had flourished unchecked. In the days leading up to the hearing, tension throughout the county escalated dramatically. Broderick's core supporters made veiled threats about armed resistance if the judge was arrested. Federal troops patrolled the streets, preventing violence but unable to ease the atmosphere of impending confrontation. Black families stayed close to home, uncertain whether the federal presence would protect them or simply postpone retaliation. Elias remained at the safe house, continuing to organize evidence and prepare his own testimony. He would be called to speak at the hearing, to present his account directly and answer questions from both the marshal and the judge's representatives. The prospect did not frighten him. He had faced worse scrutiny during the war, but he understood its importance. This was not just about his burned cabin or his stolen piece. This was about whether truth and law could prevail against entrenched power and racial terrorism. On the Sunday before the hearing, Asa Dalton visited him at Eloise Parker's cabin. The sheriff looked haggard, as though he had not slept in days. "They're planning something," Asa said without preamble. "Broderick and his inner circle. I don't know exactly what, but I've heard talk about disrupting the hearing, making it impossible for Briggs to proceed. How? Could be anything. False emergencies, attacking the federal troops, burning the courthouse. I just know they're desperate, and desperate men do desperate things." Elias considered this. Briggs prepared for trouble, as prepared as he can be with 20 soldiers and hostile locals. But if Broderick really commits to violence, it could get bad fast. A lot of people could die. Then we make sure the hearing happens before they can organize anything major. We move fast, present evidence clearly, and force Broderick to answer questions while federal authority is strongest. Asa nodded slowly. Briggs said the same thing. Wants to start early, finish before noon if possible. Get the testimony on record before anyone has time to interfere. They discussed logistics for another hour, planning how to ensure witnesses could testify safely, how to protect vulnerable families from retaliation, how to maintain order if violence erupted. It was grimly familiar work for Elias, reminiscent of planning reconnaissance missions during the war. The tactics were different, but the underlying principle remained the same. Think ahead, anticipate threats, and never assume your opponent's next move would be rational. As Asa prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "I'm sorry, Elias, for not helping you when it mattered, for standing aside while they burned your home. I can't undo it, but I want you to know I'll do better. Already have been doing better. I know." Miriam would say that's what matters, not what you did wrong, but what you do right afterward. She was a wise woman. Elias felt the familiar ache of grief, and she'd want me to forgive you, so I will. But earn it, Asa. Earn it every day by being the lawman you should have been that night. I intend to. After the sheriff left, Elias sat on the porch watching the sun set through the pine trees. Tomorrow would determine whether months of patient preparation, dangerous evidence gathering, and carefully cultivated testimonies would result in actual justice or simply postpone the inevitable violence. He thought about Miriam's insistence on choosing peace even when peace seemed impossible, about her belief that systems could change if enough people chose courage simultaneously, about her faith that truth mattered, that documentation and witness could overcome power and prejudice. He had fought her way, had gathered evidence instead of seeking revenge, had built a case instead of building an arsenal, had trusted in law and federal authority even when local power was corrupt. Tomorrow would reveal whether that trust was justified or naive, whether truth was strong enough to break cycles of violence, or whether violence remained the only language men like Judge Broderick understood. Elias went inside, reviewed his testimony one final time, and slept fitfully, dreaming of fires and courtrooms and Miriam's steady voice reminding him that how you fought mattered as much as whether you won. The courthouse filled before dawn. Federal soldiers stood guard at every entrance, checking for weapons and maintaining order as people crowded into the gallery. Black families occupied one section, white families another. The division is absolute, as it was predictable, but within each section, Elias noticed fractures. Some white residents sat apart from Judge Broderick's visible supporters, creating physical distance that suggested moral distance as well. Marshal Briggs entered at precisely 7 o'clock, followed by his clerks and 2 federal judges brought from Montgomery to ensure the proceedings met legal standards. Judge Broderick sat at the defense table with 2 attorneys, his expression a mask of indignation and barely controlled fury. He did not look at Elias, who sat in the witness section alongside Asa Dalton, Nathaniel Crawford, and others who would testify. The hearing began with procedural formalities, establishing jurisdiction. outlining the charges under investigation, confirming the legal authority of federal courts to examine activities that involved interstate commerce and civil rights, protections guaranteed under Reconstruction amendments. Judge Broderick's attorneys objected repeatedly, but each objection was overruled with citations to established precedent. Then Marshal Briggs called his first witness, Thomas Whitfield. The boy entered looking pale and frightened, his eyes darting to Judge Broderick before settling on his own hands. His testimony was halting at first, but gradually gained strength as he realized no one would punish him for telling the truth. "They asked me to hide," Thomas said. "Told me it was like a game, but I had to stay in the cabin and not come out no matter what. Said they'd pay my parents money if I did it right." "Who asked you to do this?" Briggs asked Mr. Jennings, and Judge Broderick was there when they explained it. "Did they tell you why?" "Said they needed to teach someone a lesson. Didn't say who exactly, just that it was important for keeping the county safe." The defense attorneys tried to discredit Thomas's testimony by suggesting he was too young to understand what he had witnessed, but the boy's account remained consistent through aggressive questioning. He had been hidden deliberately, his disappearance weaponized to justify violence, and he knew it. Next came Harold Jennings, who testified under immunity agreement. His account corroborated Thomas's and added damning details about Judge Broderick's explicit instructions: where to hide the boy, when to rescue him, how to frame the narrative that Elias was dangerous and the mob's response was justified, self-defense. Judge said it didn't matter if the Negro died in the fire. Jennings testified, his voice barely above a whisper, said it would solve the problem either way, rid of him or scare him into selling. Those were his exact words. Near enough. He's used similar language before when discussing other colored families who wouldn't cooperate. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Federal soldiers moved to maintain order while Briggs called for silence. Judge Broderick leaned forward, whispering furiously to his attorneys, but there was nothing they could do. Jennings's testimony was protected, and his willingness to implicate himself lent credibility to his accusations against others. Nathaniel Crawford testified next, describing the threats that had coerced him into joining the mob. He provided names of other reluctant participants, documented the coordination that proved this was organized rather than spontaneous, and submitted written records of conversations where Judge Broderick had explicitly planned the attack. "He told us it had to be done right," Crawford said. "Had to look legal, had to seem like we were protecting the community. But everyone knew what it really was, stealing a man's land through terror." By mid-morning, a dozen witnesses had testified, each one adding layers of detail to a pattern that was undeniable. Judge Broderick's attorneys attempted various defense strategies, claiming the witnesses were lying for revenge, suggesting federal investigators had coerced testimonies, arguing that local customs superseded federal interference. None of it worked. The evidence was too strong, too consistent, too thoroughly documented. Then Marshal Briggs called Elias Mercer to testify. The courtroom went completely silent as Elias walked to the witness chair. He wore his Sunday clothes, the same outfit he had worn to church with Miriam before she died. He sat calmly, placed his hands on the Bible for oath-taking, and met Marshal Briggs's eyes steadily. "Mr. Mercer, please tell us in your own words what happened on the night of August 17th. Elias did. He spoke clearly and without emotion, describing the mob's arrival, Judge Broderick's fake warrant, the coordinated burning of his home, and his escape through tunnels he had built years earlier for exactly such emergencies. He explained his tactical background, his service during the war, and why he had chosen to gather evidence rather than flee or retaliate. "I could have disappeared," Elias said. "Could have left Alabama entirely, started over somewhere else. But that would mean Judge Broderick wins, would mean every black family in this county lives under threat of the same treatment. I stayed because running away solves nothing. Evidence solves things. Truth solves things. Were you afraid? Of course. But fear don't excuse surrender. My wife taught me that. She faced fear every day of her life, fear of violence, of loss, of never being safe in a country that was supposed to be hers. But she never let fear make her choices. I'm trying to honor that." Judge Broderick's lead attorney stood for cross-examination. He was a portly man named Silas Kent, known for aggressive courtroom tactics. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it true that you hold a grudge against my client, that you view him as representative of white authority you resent?" "No, sir. I view him as a criminal who tried to kill me and steal my land. His being white ain't relevant to that." "But you admit you were a Union soldier during the war." that you fought against Southern interests. I fought against slavery and secession. If you consider those Southern interests, then yes. And now you're using federal power to attack a respected local official who was simply trying to maintain order in his county. Elias leaned forward slightly. Respected by who? The families he cheated out of their land, the officials he bribed to look the other way, the mob he organized to burn my home while I was inside it. His voice remained level, but his words landed like hammer strikes. You call that maintaining order. I call it terrorism under color of law. Kent tried various other angles, suggesting Elias had provoked the attack, questioning the authenticity of documents he had recovered, implying his military background made him inherently violent and unreliable. But each attempt failed. Elias's testimony was too detailed, too consistent with other witnesses, too clearly backed by physical evidence. Finally, Marshal Briggs called Judge Silas Broderick himself to testify. The judge took the stand with visible reluctance, his earlier confidence eroded by hours of damaging testimony. He denied everything. Denied planning the mob attack. Denied forging land documents. Denied bribing officials or threatening families. His denials were emphatic, but increasingly desperate, as Briggs walked him through specific evidence. This is your handwriting, is it not? Briggs held up the ledger. It could be a forgery. Created by whom? Mr. Mercer, who also somehow convinced 17 separate witnesses to provide false testimony, who burned his own home and then framed you for it. I don't know how he did it. I just know I'm innocent. You deny being at Elias Mercer's property the night of August 17th. Broderick hesitated. Too many people had seen him there. I was present, but only to serve a legitimate warrant. A warrant for a child who was never missing. A warrant you had no authority to issue since the case involved potential federal crimes. I was acting in good faith, based on information available at the time. Information you manufactured. Information you paid the Whitfields to support. Information designed to justify burning a man alive in his own home. That's not what happened. Then, explain what did happen. Explain why 300 men surrounded Mr. Mercer's cabin. Explain why they set fire to his property without allowing him to exit. Explain why you've been pressuring him for months to sell land he doesn't want to sell. Judge Broderick had no good answers. His testimony devolved into contradictions and implausible denials. His attorneys tried to object, to redirect, to call for recesses, but the damage was done. The mask had fallen away, revealing not respected authority, but criminal conspiracy. When Broderick finally stepped down, his face was ashen. He understood what was coming. Marshal Briggs consulted briefly with the federal judges, then stood to address the court. Based on the evidence presented and testimony received, this hearing finds sufficient cause to charge Silas Broderick with conspiracy to commit murder, arson, fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of civil rights under federal Reconstruction statutes. Additional charges may be filed pending further investigation. The courtroom exploded. Broderick's supporters shouted protests while his opponents cheered. Federal soldiers moved to maintain order and escort the judge to custody. Broderick himself seemed stunned, as though he had never truly believed this outcome was possible. As soldiers led him from the courtroom, he turned to look at Elias. Their eyes met across the crowded room. In that moment, Elias saw not the powerful judge but simply a broken man, facing consequences he had always believed himself immune to. Elias felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just exhaustion and a profound relief that truth had prevailed without requiring him to become the violent man Broderick had accused him of being. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd dispersed into morning sunlight, Asa Dalton approached Elias. You did it. You actually did it. We did it. All of us together. Couldn't have happened without people choosing to speak truth despite the risks. What happens now? Now, Elias looked toward the forest where his destroyed cabin lay in ruins. Now I rebuild, and I try to believe that this time, it'll stand. 6 weeks after the hearing, a crew of 20 workers began clearing the ruins of Elias's cabin. The crew was mixed black, freedmen and white residents, former mob participants and people who had supported Elias from the beginning. They worked together in a silence that gradually warmed into cautious conversation, then collaboration, then something that might eventually become community. Marshal Briggs had stayed in the county to oversee broader reforms. Judge Broderick was in federal custody awaiting trial in Montgomery. His network of corrupt officials had largely collapsed once the ledger's contents became public. County positions were being filled with federal appointees who had no connection to the previous power structure. It was fragile progress, likely to face backlash. But it was progress nonetheless. Elias worked alongside the crew, his hands returning to carpentry with familiar ease. The new cabin would be larger than the original, with better foundation and stronger framing. Other black families whose land had been stolen were also rebuilding, their property rights restored through federal intervention. The landscape was gradually transforming from one of fear and forced silence to something that might eventually resemble justice. On a cool October afternoon, Asa Dalton arrived at the construction site. He had been confirmed as permanent sheriff, his courage during the investigation earning respect from federal authorities and grudging acceptance from locals, who recognized competent law enforcement when they saw it. "Brought you something," Asa said, dismounting from his horse. He handed Elias a sealed envelope. "Official deed to your property. Federal seal, registered with Montgomery. No one can dispute it now." Elias opened the envelope carefully, studying the document. His name was written clearly in official script: Elias Mercer, sole owner of 43 acres along Choctaw Creek. Below that, notations in legal language protecting his rights under federal authority. "Thank you. Don't thank me. You earned this the hard way." Asa paused, watching the construction work. Most men would have run, or fought back violently. You did neither, just gathered truth until it was too heavy to ignore. My wife's way. She believed in building rather than destroying. She was right. They stood together watching workers fit a beam into place, the carpentry precise and strong. Isaiah Williams, a young freedman who had proven himself an excellent builder, directed the crew with growing confidence. He called out measurements, adjusted angles, ensured everything aligned properly. The cabin was rising from ashes into something new. "What about the others?" Elias asked. "The mob participants, most are facing consequences, not as severe as Broderick. He was the architect, but fines, probation, community service. Some lost their positions in town government. Others are being monitored by federal authorities." Asa shifted his weight. "A few have apologized. To you specifically. Want to make amends. I don't need their apologies. Need them to do better going forward." That's what I told them. As the afternoon progressed, more visitors arrived. Nathaniel Crawford brought supplies from his store, refusing payment despite Elias's insistence. Harold Jennings came to apologize directly, his face marked by shame but his presence suggesting genuine remorse. Thomas Whitfield's parents visited, bringing food and expressing gratitude that Elias had not demanded harsher consequences for their role in the scheme. "We were scared," Mrs. Whitfield said, her eyes red from crying. "They offered money, said no one would get hurt. We didn't understand what we were part of until it was too late." "Fear makes people do things they regret," Elias replied. "What matters is choosing different when given another chance." By evening, the cabin's frame was complete. Workers gathered to admire their progress, sharing food and conversation as daylight faded. Lanterns were lit, but these were welcoming lights, gentle and warm, not the threatening flames of the mob. Elias sat on a temporary bench, watching the scene unfold. He thought about Miriam, about how proud she would be that he had fought without killing, had defended himself without destroying others, had chosen truth over vengeance, even when vengeance would have been easier. He thought about the 300 men who had surrounded his home, believing he was helpless, how they had underestimated what a man could do when he refused to fight on their terms, how their weapons and numbers meant nothing against evidence and courage and the patient gathering of truth. Marshal Briggs approached, sitting beside him on the bench. "You've become something of a symbol, you know. Word of what happened here has spread throughout the state. Other black landowners are standing up to corrupt officials, demanding federal protection, documenting crimes. You started something. Didn't start it, just showed it was possible. That's often enough." They sat in comfortable silence as stars emerged overhead. The crew began dispersing, families heading home with promises to return tomorrow. The work would continue for weeks, not just building Elias's cabin, but rebuilding trust, reconstructing community, reimagining what justice might look like in a place where violence had reigned unchallenged for too long. Asa was the last to leave. He paused before mounting his horse. "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "That night, when you gave me the ledger, you took a huge risk trusting me. What made you think I wouldn't just hand it to Broderick?" Elias considered the question carefully. "Miriam used to say, everyone has a better self inside them. waiting for circumstances that demanded rise. You'd shown shame, which meant your conscience wasn't dead, just needed something to wake it up. She sounds like she was remarkable. She was, and she'd be glad you proved her right. After Asa departed, Elias remained alone beneath the stars. The night was quiet, except for crickets and distant owls. He spoke quietly to Miriam's memory, to the woman whose wisdom had guided him through the darkest night of his life. "I did it your way," he said. "Didn't kill anyone, didn't become what they accused me of being, just gathered truth and trusted it would be enough. You were right, it was enough." The words settled into the darkness like a benediction, a truth earned through fire and restraint, through patience when violence would have been easier, through faith that systems could change if enough people chose courage over fear. In the weeks and months that followed, Elias's cabin was completed. Other families rebuilt as well. Federal oversight continued, gradually transforming the county's power structures from tools of oppression into something approaching actual law. It was incomplete progress, fragile and contested, but real nonetheless. Years later, when people asked Elias about the night 300 men surrounded his home, he would tell them the truth, that he had survived not through superior firepower or tactical genius, but through understanding that some battles are won by refusing to fight the way your enemies expect. That evidence gathered patiently is stronger than violence deployed hastily. That truth, when documented and witnessed, becomes unstoppable. He would tell them about Miriam, about her insistence on building rather than destroying, on choosing peace even when peace seemed impossible, about how her wisdom had saved not just his life but his soul, had shown him that strength could exist without cruelty, that defense did not require attack, that justice could be achieved without adding to the violence that already saturated their world. And he would end by saying what he told young Isaiah Williams, when the boy asked how to face injustice without becoming bitter: "You stand your ground, you document what happens, you find allies who share your commitment to truth, and you trust that righteousness, when persistent and patient, will eventually outlast oppression." The words became something of a legend in that corner of Alabama, a testament to one man's refusal to be erased. 300 lanterns that meant to destroy but instead revealed the weakness of power built on fear, a reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapon is not a gun or a sword, but a detailed record kept by someone who refuses to forget. Elias Mercer lived another 23 years. He rebuilt his life, his home, and his community. He attended church on Sundays, worked his carpentry during the week, and sat on his porch most evenings watching the forest where the mob had emerged that August night. He never forgot what happened, but neither did he let it define him. He died peacefully in his sleep at age 7, surrounded by friends and the generations of young people who had learned from his example. His funeral was attended by hundreds of black families and white families, people who had supported him and people who had opposed him but learned to respect him. At the funeral, someone read a final entry from Elias's journal, written weeks before his death: "I have lived long enough to see justice happen and to see it fail, long enough to know that neither outcome is permanent. The work of building a decent world never ends. Each generation must choose whether to add to the construction or stand aside while others destroy what was built before. I chose construction. I hope others will choose the same." The words were carved into his headstone, placed beside Miriam's in the small cemetery near where his cabin once stood. And on summer nights, when cicadas sing their ancient hymn, people still tell the story of Elias Mercer the carpenter who survived 300 lanterns by understanding that truth, patiently gathered and courageously spoken, is the strongest foundation any justice can stand upon. End. This account was recovered from the Federal Archives in Montgomery, Alabama, compiled from testimony, letters, and journal entries documenting events in the summer and fall of 1874. While the names and specific locations have been verified through historical records, the emotional truths contained within transcend mere documentation. They speak to every person who has ever faced overwhelming power and chosen to stand firm in dignity rather than surrender to fear.